One of the greatest celebrators of Lincoln was Walt Whitman, and we will come to the end of our formal program before the town-wide chorus with an adaptation of Whitman's elegy for Lincoln, When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed.
When lilacs last in the dooryard bloomed, and the great star early drooped in the western sky in the night, I mourned, oh, and yet shall mourn with ever-returning spring. Ever-returning spring, Trinity sure to me you bring. Lilac blooming perennial, drooping star in the west, and the thought of him I love. In the dooryard, fronting an old farmhouse, near the whitewashed paling stands a lilac bush, tall growing, with heart-shaped leaves of rich green, with many a pointed blossom rising delicate, with the perfume strong I love, with every leaf a miracle. And from this bush in the dooryard, with delicate colored blossoms and heart-shaped leaves of rich green, a sprig with its flower I break, while in the swamp, in secluded recesses, a shy and hidden bird is warbling a song. So solitary, the hidden thrush, the hermit, withdrawn to himself, avoiding the settlements, sings by himself a song, song of the bleeding throat, song of the bleeding throat, life's outlet, song of life it seems. For well, dear brother, I know if you were not granted to sing, you would surely die. Over the breast of the spring, amid cities, amid lanes, and through old woods, where lately the violets peeped from the ground, spotting the gray debris, amid the grass in the fields, each side of the lanes, passing the endless grass, passing the yellow-speared wheat, every grain from its shroud in the dark brown fields uprisen, passing the apple blows of pink and white blossoms in the orchards, carrying a corpse to where it shall rest in the grave, night and day journeys a coffin. Sing on, you there in the swamp, oh singer, bashful and tender, I hear the notes of your call. I hear, I come presently, I understand you now. I understand you now, but how shall I deck my helpless song for the large, sweet soul that has gone? And what shall my perfume be for the grave of him I love? Amid the processions long and winding and the flambeaux of the night, with the countless torches lit, with the silent sea of faces and the unbared heads, with the waiting depot, the arriving coffin, with the 1,000 voices rising strong and solemn, with all the mournful voices of the dirges poured around the coffin, the dim-lit churches and the shuddering organs, where amid these you journey, with the tolling bells' perpetual clang. Here, coffin that slowly passes, I give you my sprig of lilac. Lo, body and soul, this land, my own Manhattan, with spires and the sparkling and hurrying tides, and the ships, the varied and the ampled land, covered with grass and corn, covered with grass and corn, the violet and the purple morn, the coming evening delicious, the welcome night and the stars, enveloping man and land. And now while I sat and looked forth at the many moving sea tides, and I saw the ships how they sailed, and the summer approaching with richness, and the fields all busy with labor, and the infinite separate houses, how they all went on, each with its meals and minutiae of daily usages, lo, then and there, falling upon them all and among them all, enveloping me with the rest, appeared the cloud, appeared the long black trail, and I knew death, its thought, and the sacred knowledge of death. I fled into the receiving night that talks not, down to the shores of the water, by the swamp, to the shadowy cedar trees, and the ghostly pine so still, the ghostly pine so still, and the singer so shy, the gray-brown bird, received us comrades three. He sang the carol of death, and a verse for him I love. Yet each to keep and all, retrievements out of the night, the song, the wondrous chant of the gray-brown bird, and the tallying chant, the echo arose in my soul, with the comrades mine and I in their midst, and their memory ever to keep, for the dead I love so well, for the sweetest, wisest soul of all my days and lands, and this for his dear sake. Lilac and star and bird, twined with the chant of my soul, there in the fragrant pines and the cedars, dusk and dim. When lilacs last in the dooryard bloomed, and the great star early drooped in the western sky in the night, I mourned, oh, and yet shall mourn, with ever-returning spring, ever-returning spring, Trinity shore to me you bring, lilacs blooming perennial, drooping star in the west, and the thought of him I love.
So friends, we have our next speaker who will speak to Lincoln and Emerson, trustees of the young American soul. So building on John's words, we come a little bit closer to home, is Richard Kotlarz, a Transcendentalist scholar who's come to us from Minnesota for this evening.
We talk about the time from the Revolution until the Civil War as being the first, 77 years of our new nation. That was not a fact at that time. The nation was very much an experiment in whether humankind could even take on the burden of sovereignty as common men and form a government that could actually govern itself. To Lincoln, that was his number one issue. Whether that government could long endure, whether a government of, by, and for the people would or would not perish from the earth. And that has to be seen as the backdrop of every other thing that he says in my understanding. As Stuart said at the beginning of this, before the Civil War, Americans referred to themselves, when they talked about the country, they said the United States are. After the Civil War, they said the United States is. I don't know if they even thought about that. It's something that really came from the deep. And out of that, even after, and out of that trial period, and out of that crucible, absolute crucible of this amalgam of different and disparate people being thrown together in this new land under these new conditions, in this new way, out of that crucible came like sort of a shiny new metal, a new form of gold. And that was this new form of government this new form of sovereignty that could govern itself. The question then remains, who were what I would call the alchemists that presided over this transubstantiation? There are many important figures in our history, ones that are very prominent, but I would nominate two. One is Abraham Lincoln, of course. Who else could I nominate tonight? The other is Ralph Waldo Emerson. And I think that it's time that we stop taking each one as isolated sort of academic subjects, one in the area of philosophy, one in the area of politics, one with this life, one with that life, and it's time that we see them as their destinies as being bound together as part of the emergence of the American destiny path. In the early part of I would like to for you to exercise your imagination for a moment, and that is, I would like you to imagine this country absent Abraham Lincoln. That means there would be no Emancipation Proclamation. That means there would be no Gettysburg Address. That means there would be no second inaugural address. That means there would be no Lincoln head on the face of the penny. That means Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech would have had to find a new location, with all the symbolism that and meaning that carries with it. I think that if we were to imagine American history and the emergence of the American nation gutted of everything that even referred to or had anything that had to do with the life of Abraham Lincoln, right onto the Civil War or before the Civil War, right up into now, what would we have left? I would even ask, I just got through reading a book by Doris Kearns Goodwin about Lincoln's cabinet, a team of rivals. I recommend it to people as quite a tome, where she spent 750 pages really getting into the life of all these men around Lincoln, and it's a really deep insight into the statesmen, the politicians, the soldier, the citizens of that time. And I would ask you, what one among them, pick any one, put him in Lincoln's place, then rerun the story, would we have a nation? Of course, that's the road not taken, so we can never really know the truth of that. But in my view, I find it when I was doing that, as I was reading, what if Chase had won the nomination for presidency? What if Seward had won it? What if Bates had won it? What if Douglas had won it? What if other people had come forth? What if other things hadn't been done in their time, in their time, in their time? What would have happened to this? And I find it very difficult to imagine that we would have a nation. One part of my work is to work with the monetary realm. And I'll be giving a talk on that tomorrow. This nation not only brought a new birth of freedom in a lot of ways, it also brought a new monetary system, a new way of doing money. When Lincoln was pressed to finance the Civil War through borrowing at exorbitant rates, his administration instead issued the greenback, issued $450 million of the greenbacks. Had he not then, or had his administration not done that, that debt would still be on the books at many, many, many times its rate, compounded. And would we even have a nation financially? And so from many ways, I mean, Lincoln is so essential to our story, I don't know what we would have without it. I would ask you to exercise your imagination. I've given talks, I've visited the Old North Bridge in Concord, the place where the shot heard around the world was fired. This town here has so much meaning in that American Revolution. What meaning would it have now except the footnote in history if that revolution had failed? If that union had not been preserved, if those people had not been free, if we had not taken back the sovereignty over our own monetary system, what would we have now? Play that through, and I think that you can see there would be a very, very different picture. Now, that brings us to the point, brings us to Ralph Waldo Emerson. If Concord was not the seat of this nation that we have, this new experiment and a government of, by, and for the people, what meaning would it have? And without Ralph Waldo Emerson, what would Concord be without that white residence up the road here? What would Concord be without his residency at Old Manse? What would Concord be without those words on that Minuteman statue down at the Old North Bridge? What would Concord be without that home that David Thoreau actually went to and virtually lived in while he supposedly abode at Walden Pond? What would the American culture, what would the American spirit be without that philosophical canon that arose out of this place? Without the central place of Emerson, how would that have affected Thoreau? How would that have affected Hawthorne? How would it have affected Elkhart? How would that have affected the School of Philosophy? How would that have affected Walt Whitman, who knew both Emerson and Lincoln? How would that have affected, just go right on down the line. What would we have? The American culture. You could take the whole heap of American literary and philosophical and spiritual canon, pile it here on stage, and if you took out the fact of Emerson's life and its effect in every one of that, I think that heap would collapse right here in front of us. And so these men were so intertwined. And like the first here's this history, this nation, through this birth process that it went through, through this birth pangs that it went through, politically tore itself apart. Just absolutely rent it apart. The casualties in the Civil War alone were 625,000. All the other wars in American history combined come nowhere near that. And this is against a very much smaller base of population. Also during that time, America did not really have a philosophy, a philosophical heart, a cultural heart. That formed here in Concord. And Emerson and Thoreau and Alcott and Hawthorne, those went forth into the world as being the parts of this American spirit that Gandhi and others saw as being essentially American, and have since identified as with America, with the best part of America, with the heart and soul of America. So take Emerson out of this, and what do you have? And so, and if you, I guess I should, it's obvious to point out that the productive years of both of these men's life were almost exactly the same. They were born in the same decade, they died a little farther apart, but their productive work was exactly the same. And when, we read lots of stories about, the Lincoln's assassination and the funeral train and, the John Wilkes Booth at the Ford Theater and all this. Very, very seldom. In fact, I've almost never heard it mentioned. It is there. You can Google it. You can find it. But it's almost never mentioned that when that assassination happened, Emerson was at the height not only of his, literary and his philosophical powers, but of his fame. He was known. He was a household word around the world. I mean, I've heard him compared to a rock star, but I don't like that comparison in a lot of ways because of the connotation, but it was that level of fame. And when Lincoln died, who did the nation turn to for the words? It turned to Ralph Waldo Emerson. Now, Emerson and Lincoln did not know each other very well personally. They had met. As I understand it, and if there's any historians here that know better, they can correct me, Emerson did visit Lincoln in the White House one time. And because he was forced to wait on Lincoln, he played on the floor with Lincoln's kids. And I kind of like that image. It's very humanizing. It's also been said, and I've talked to at least one Emerson scholar about this, but it has not been proved, that Lincoln probably attended at least one Emerson lecture, maybe more. But historians can't seem to come to a conclusion on that. But however sparing the personal contact there was between the two men, the fact of their lives in the same nation, in the same place, and the way they interacted were like two pillars of the American experience. And I don't believe that we can understand one without the other. And so that's what I want to talk about here tonight. I would like to read a few words from Emerson's eulogy to Lincoln. There was a few included in the previous musical piece that we just had, so I won't be redundant about that. Emerson said, "I doubt if any death has caused so much pain to mankind as this has caused or will cause on its announcement. No other death in history has caused that much." That's a big statement. Was he just being eulogizing? You know, like somebody just emotionally carried away, or was this a level-headed man that meant this? What did he mean by that? It is not, and this, not so much because nations are by modern arts brought so closely together, as because of the mysterious hopes and fears which, in the present days, are connected with the name and institutions of America. Emerson and Lincoln understood that America meant something. It wasn't just another nation. It was a great experiment. It was a coming together. And that's why they knew that if this nation died, the cause of emancipation and many other things would die with it, at least for a long time. Emerson says, "The president stood before us as a man of the people. He was thoroughly American, had never crossed the sea, had never been soiled by English insularity or French dissipation. A quite native..." Please, I didn't write it. I'm not vouching for anything. But he's trying to get at something here, and I think the next words do it. He's not putting anybody down. "A quiet native, aboriginal man, as an acorn from the oak, no aping of foreigners, no frivolous accomplishments, a Kentuckian born, working on a farm, a flatboatman, a captain in the Black Hawk War, a country lawyer, a representative in the rural legislature of Illinois. On such modest foundations, the broad structure of his fame was laid." The very things that other politicians would cite as disqualifications, or would feel would be disqualifications, those were Lincoln's qualifications. And the beauty of Emerson is that he got it. He gets it about Lincoln. And that's one reason there's such a close symbiosis between the work of these two men. He says, of Lincoln, he offered no shining qualities at the first encounter. I mean, we've heard about Lincoln's look, right? Not of shining quality. He did not offend by superiority. His brief speech at Gettysburg will not easily be surpassed by words on any recorded occasion. Father of his country, the pulse of 20 millions throbbing in his heart, the thought of their minds articulated by his tongue. Emerson, in his essay, Self-Reliance, well, first of all, I would say that there's one verse from Emerson where he says, "The wealth of the universe is for me. Everything is explicable and practical for me. I am defeated all the time, yet to victory I am born." If one were to read the biography of Lincoln, as I just did, the man was defeated all the time. You know, I mean, it's just, he only won at the last. You know, he was defeated time after time in an election. He was defeated in this contest and that. But he had many personal losses and defeats in his life. The whole Civil War was just one crushing defeat after another for a person that was so attached to life, so gentle, so compassionate about life, so attuned to other people's suffering. It's a huge defeat. We can't imagine that. And yet, ultimately his was victory. Emerson says in Self-Reliance, and I think Lincoln is probably the embodiment of self-reliance, of who Emerson was talking about. And I only have a couple more minutes, so I got to get there. To talk of the reliance as a poor external way of speaking, rather talk of that which relies because it works and it works and it is. It works and it is. Who has more obedience than I masters me, though he should not raise his finger. Round him I must resolve by the gravitation of spirits. We fancy it rhetoric when we speak of eminent value. We do not see that virtue is height, and that a man or a company of men, plastic and permeable to principles by the law of nature, must overpower and ride all cities, nations, kings, rich men, poets, and who are not. Poets and poets who are not. Is he perhaps talking about Lincoln? Probably not consciously so, but there has to be that typical man out there. That's somebody out there that would give this first meaning. And I think a case can be made for it, and I would offer this. And it's something that was written by Leo Tolstoy, the great Russian author who's many people consider the greatest author of our time. Tolstoy was invited to a remote village in the North Caucasus of Russia to stay with a tribal chief. And this is a very remote place, untouched by civilization. And so this chief, he gathered his people around him, and he knew that he had a great man staying with him, and he asked, tell us about the great men in the world, the history of the great men of the world. And so Tolstoy says, wow, this is my gig, this is what I do. So he gave it to him. He gave them hours worth. He told them about Alexander the Great. He told them about Caesar. He told them about Frederick the Great. He told them about Napoleon. And when he was finally winding down in his very long discourse, the chief kind of rose up and he says, yeah, but tell us about the greatest one. Who are you talking about? The greatest one. His name was Lincoln, and he was an American. And he was from a land so far away that if we tried to go there, we'd be old men by the time we got there. Tell us about this man. We've heard about him. And so Tolstoy proceeded to tell him everything that he knew about Lincoln. And he says the people were just enthralled. They're just beaming. They were just aglow with the story. And at the end of it, they were so grateful for the story that they gave him their finest Arabian horse. And the next day, they asked Tolstoy was getting ready to leave, and asked him, well, do you have a picture of Lincoln, one that we can have? And he didn't have one, but he thought maybe he could get one in a nearby town. So he asked for a writer to go with him, and they would go to try to secure a picture, a photograph. And they did secure a photograph. And when Tolstoy gave the photograph to this writer to take back to the village, he recounts how this man, when he took it, he just trembled. And he took it as if he'd given like a holy icon or something like that. And he took it prayerfully, and he just wept before he finally left with that. That's the power of Lincoln. That's the power of Lincoln. And that's that sort of power, this power of the common man, raised to that kind of character, raised to that kind of virtue, that could be the message of this country. It was born here. We've got it. I think, I've said some things here, other people saying this. I have to say something about what I think is the cutting edge of this, where Lincoln's power really was. Lincoln, in his cabinet, he didn't pick all the people that agreed with him. He picked the strongest people in the nation, the strongest heads, the biggest egos sometimes in the nation. He put them in his cabinet because he says, I need that strength. I need to forge something out of that. And that's what he did. He put Chase, he put Seward, he put Bates, he put his presidential rivals. He put abolitionists. People are in favor of abolition, people that were not. And in the end, and through bitter battles and the recriminations, the things some of these people did against him, he eventually won them over, I think without exception, and they became totally loyal to him. Frederick Douglass, as he's watching the public, progress of Lincoln's, supposedly trying to, free the slaves and this and that, he's pretty upset about what he's hearing, and all the sort of duplicity seems to be manifesting until he met Lincoln. And that was a revelation for him. That changed his life. Douglass said, and I can't quite quote him here, that of all the men he's ever met, Lincoln has the least amount of racism. He's the truest man he's ever met. He's the least amount of racism. And this is a man that hung out with, Garrison and all the other the leading abolitionists of his day. And he says there's not a trace of anything in Lincoln that reminds Douglass of the distinction between their races. General Grant said Abraham Lincoln was the greatest man I ever knew. General Grant has seen some great men if he's watched some of his soldiers in battle. But he counted Lincoln the greatest. What about Robert E. Lee? Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox, and then as soon as he surrendered, he turns his full energy to trying to get the Southern armies to quit and to come back into the Union. And if without that, that war could have gone on as a guerrilla war. That could have been messy, could have been gone on to this day, maybe, who knows. But somebody asked Robert E. Lee, why this enemy, this mortal enemy of yours, you so recently fought, this Union, this Yankee Union, why did you surrender so completely? He says, I didn't surrender to the Union. He says, I surrendered to Abraham Lincoln. That's the power of Lincoln. So what is the power of Lincoln? I think we have to say what it is. I think we can't just make some sort of, patriotic bubble here and go home with, a feeling about it. I think we have to say what it is. Abraham Lincoln is a person that when he got face to face with another person, never dismissed him. Lived into that person all the time. Never called them crazy. Never called whatever was trying to come from them, however peaceful or true or vexed and low or whatever, never called it beneath him that he couldn't meet it and meet that person on that ground. And he did it over and over and over in conversation. I mean, conversation for Lincoln was a pretty wild affair sometimes. It was the stories, it's a lot of things. But really talking face to face, meeting that person soul to soul, bring that person forward. And that's how he conquered the world. He didn't do it any other way. And I've read through the stuff about him. I don't know that he had really any other weapons. We live. We are right now. We don't. When I say we, I mean the crowd here. I don't live here, but we are in a town right here, in which conversational philosophy was established as a basis of American philosophy. There's a school of philosophy and literature, Concord School of Philosophy and Literature, over behind Orchid House. That was established by Bronson Alcott, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and the other surviving elites of the Transcendental movement. That, for me, in a spiritual, cultural sense, in a way that Lincoln used it in a political sense, partakes of the same spirit. I think they are one. I think they recognize each other. I think they manifested themselves in parallel lives of Lincoln and Emerson. I think they are two pillars of the American experience. And we, at this very troubled time, and we'll talk about some of this over the weekend if anybody's interested, is really what we need to become conscious of and take up as a way forward, as a new sort of birth of freedom in this land, so we can move forward on the foundation of the work of these two great men. So that's what I have for now. Thank you.
As mentioned, the composer is David Conte, and the librettist, the person who wrote the text, is John Sterling Walker. They've collaborated on a number of pieces. Recently, there was an NPR interview on their work, Homecoming in honor of Martin Luther King. They're invited to commission a piece that takes the name Lincoln for this evening. The singer is unfortunately indisposed. The poet is not. The text will be spoken this evening. And we have both citizens from Concord and friends who, in rather short notice, have composed a chamber orchestra. Welcome and thank you.
we stood here in Concord, Emerson stood here and gave us remarks. They pertained to a man, and that man, no matter what you think about it, that man was true. Emerson stood here and made remarks. About a man, true, who through and through knew what was to do. The sage of Concord said, his occupying the chair of state was a triumph of the good sense of mankind. Providence makes its own instruments, creates the man for the time, trains him in poverty, inspires his genius, and arms him for his task. Ralph went on. It has given every race its own talent, and ordains that only that race which combines perfectly with the virtues of all shall endure. Such a race. Yes. Such a race is true. Are we true? Are you?
Our next speaker is John Stauffer, Chair of the History of American Civilization Studies at Harvard University.
I want to talk about the relationship between Lincoln and the abolitionists, and then I want to bring it close to home in the sense of talk about how Concordians, is that how you pronounce yourselves or describe yourselves? Good. Concordians helped to elect Abraham Lincoln. As the excerpts from the Lincoln-Douglas debates that you've just heard suggest and in some places explicate, there's a crucial difference between Abraham Lincoln and abolitionists. The easiest way to summarize abolitionists are that they believed in an immediate end to slavery and racial equality, equality under the law. For all men, and for the most radical of abolitionists, they believed in racial equality for men, for women, for everyone. Now, there was often a distinction between their vision of racial equality and their ability to put it into practice even in their own neighborhoods, but that's the basic premise. Lincoln was anti-slavery. It's the basic premise of the Republican Party. Lincoln hated slavery. On numerous occasions, he said that he hated slavery as much as any abolitionist. In fact, he said at one point, if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. There's little reason to doubt Lincoln's disdain for slavery. But what distinguished him from abolitionists was the crucial the strategy that he had for ending it. And that strategy, throughout his entire life, with the exception of the last 2 years, and in certain cases a year and a half, Lincoln had a threefold strategy for ending slavery. One is very gradual, very congenial emancipation, so as to not uproot society. And in fact, in his debates with Stephen Douglas, when pressed on when he envisioned the ultimate extinction of slavery, Lincoln said, this was in 1858, in not less than 100 years. So in his ideal world, the end of slavery would be so gradual, so very congenial, that the earliest emancipation would come was 1958. Second, he believed in compensation to masters for the loss of their quote-unquote property. And third, he advocated through subsidies, government subsidies, through encouragement, colonization of those blacks who were free. So in essence, his vision of America, of American democracy, was a white one. Two crucial distinctions between abolitionists and anti-slavery advocates, or Lincoln's position. Nevertheless, I want to argue that abolitionists were absolutely indispensable to Lincoln's election and that their positions converge. Now, and in answering that question or developing that point, I want to tell essentially a story. It begins with this gentleman right here. He's one of the, what Jay called one of the weirdos with the long hair. This was in 1860. I think of these, one of these wonderfully self-expressive men of the time as kind of the counterpart to the 1960s counterculture, experimenting with different styles. This man is Gerrit Smith. Gerrit Smith was born in upstate New York. He came from one of the wealthiest families in the country. His father, Peter Smith, had been a business partner with John Jacob Astor. And while Astor amassed most of what is now Manhattan, Gerrit Smith's father, Peter Smith, acquired over 1 million acres of land in upstate New York. Gerrit grew up in the village his father named called Peterborough, New York, in Madison County in western New York. He went to Hamilton College, graduating in 1818. How many of you are graduates from Hamilton College here? I know 2 are. Hamilton College at the time was very, very similar to Yale. In fact, it was a new college. Gerrit was one of the early graduates. I think his graduating class was the 3rd year. Hamilton College very self-consciously modeled itself on Yale, and in certain respects it was more rigorous than Yale. Garrett graduated as valedictorian. He envisioned himself as America's Byron. He's extremely wealthy. He loved Byron more than anything else. For the rest of his life, you can't see it in this photograph because of his beard, he loved to wear the Byronic collar, the very high collar. He marries his his college sweetheart, who happened to be the daughter of the college president, and then he encounters a series of tragedies that push him on the road to abolitionism. His wife dies, his mother dies. He is asked to manage the large land that his father has. The upshot is that he's one of the exemplars of someone who I would summarize as embracing downward mobility for conscience's sake. He becomes an abolitionist, envisions a democratic nation in which blacks and whites live together as equals, and believes that democracy is against the large disparity of wealth, and believes that he should redistribute the wealth. And so he spends his money seeking to do that. In 1840, he founds the Liberty Party. The Liberty Party was the first national party that explicitly opposes slavery. It emerges in part because William Lloyd Garrison, who's essentially the head of the American Anti-Slavery Party, increasingly disdains government. By 1840, Garrison believes that any member of the party should not be able to vote. He's a staunch pacifist, and he's already calling the United States a constitution, a pro-slavery constitution, a pro-slavery document. Garrison would later famously burn the Constitution, calling it a government with hell, an agreement with death. And so Gerrit Smith, believing that the Constitution and American democracy can incorporate racial equality, forms the Liberty Party, which is an abolitionist party in which members interpret the Constitution as an anti-slavery document. And the Liberty Party, although it never acquired that many members, in an important sense, it's the trunk of the tree that becomes the Republican Party. It's the foundation for the Republican Party. How does that happen? Well, in 1848, the Liberty Party splits into two branches. The more radical branch is the National Liberty Party. The more conservative branch is the Free Soil Party. In 1855, 56, around there, well, depending on which party, the Free Soil Party merges into the Republican Party, and the National Liberty Party becomes the Radical Abolition Party. The Liberty Party is, in an important sense, the foundation for the Republican Party, because the basic premise of the Republican Party, this is a party founded by people from all different walks of life. The basic premise was that members hated slavery on moral and economic grounds, and they sought to prohibit its spread in the goal towards ultimate extinction. That hatred, that opposition, has its roots in the Liberty Party. Gerrit Smith, as I said, opposed William Lloyd Garrison, who believes the Constitution is a pro-slavery document. Gerrit Smith was deeply inspired by, another Liberty Party's members were deeply inspired by John Quincy Adams. Quincy Adams, as a congressman, was an important precursor to the ultimate emancipation of slavery, because it was John Quincy Adams who first articulates the fact that under the War Power Clause of the Constitution, the President and the Congress have the right to abolish slavery constitutionally. In fact, he first says this in Congress in 1836 when Southerners are being belligerent, and he tells them, you know what, if you keep being belligerent, there's going to be a civil war, and if there's a civil war, Congress and the President can abolish slavery. Now, Gerrit Smith and his members of the Liberty Party interpret Quincy Adams' argument, reinterpret it, in the sense that they believe that there is already a civil war existing because slavery constitutes civil war. Slavery is a war between master and slave. And so there's a civil war going on, and it's incumbent upon all righteous abolitionists to prevent this war, to end this war, to preserve the peace, and they believed that they should use force against slave owners in a way to preserve the peace. Unlike Garrison and his party, they were not pacifists. It was the Quincy Adams who through Charles Sumner, tells Lincoln that constitutionally he can end slavery through the war powers, which is precisely how the Emancipation Proclamation is framed. Frederick Douglass becomes a close friend of Gerrit Smith in the late 1840s because Gerrit Smith, as part of his vision to realize a democratic nation, gives away 120,000 acres of land to some 3,000 poor blacks in New York State. It's one of the most generous gifts of philanthropy by an individual to other individuals in American history. It amounted to roughly 40 acres. Gerrit didn't have a mule for each of these 3,000 men, but it's seen as a kind of precursor to the claim for 40 acres and a mule. Douglass is converted to political abolitionism through his friendship with Gerrit Smith, and both men become very close friends with John Brown. In fact, John Brown moves to this community of land that Gerrit Smith gives to blacks, which they refer to as Timbuktu. Brown at the time is a hopeless bankrupt. He has 21 children. He makes a special pilgrimage to Peterborough, New York, and he says, I want to live in this black community. John Brown, in one sense, felt more comfortable around blacks than he did around whites. He moves to Timbuktu, and it's there that Brown envisions his scheme for raiding the South and trying to free slaves. It begins as what he calls this subterranean passway, in which he's going to take these hand-picked men and make raids onto southern plantations, bring the slaves into the Alleghenies, run them up through the Adirondacks into Canada and free them. And the increasing loss of property to Southerners will undermine slavery in the Upper South, and it will then extend into the Lower South. That scheme of the subterranean passway then morphs into his plan to invade the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry with blacks and whites, in the hope of taking over the large arsenal of the arms at the Harper's Ferry, distributing them to the slaves and blacks in the area, and sparking a massive insurrection that will immediately free the slaves. Frederick Douglass is a champion of Brown's general scheme of invading the South. In fact, John Brown writes his provisional constitution in Douglass's home in Rochester. It's a constitution that will fulfill the Declaration of Independence, and Douglass edits the document. Gerrit Smith becomes the major conspirator of John Brown's raid, providing more funding, more encouragement, more support than any other single individual, with the exception of Frederick Douglass. Douglass and Gerrit Smith are central to Brown's ultimate raiding of Harper's Ferry, with 16 whites and 5 blacks in 1859. He's captured, of course. He's tried for treason. He's executed. And this raid on Harper's Ferry becomes an immense cause célèbre, leading directly to the Civil War. Now I want to bring in Concord to this story. Another conspirator of John Brown's raid was Franklin Sanborn. Well-known figure in Concord. He also provided money and support. Another figure was Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson knew Brown. Brown actually gave a talk in Concord. Brown considered Ralph Waldo Emerson one of his closest New England friends, and Emerson liked Brown. John Brown and Gerrit Smith and Frederick Douglass and other of these radical abolitionists endorsed Emerson's vision of self-reliance, by which all of them believed that self-reliance was essentially reliance on God. The weirdo from Concord was also a huge friend of John Brown. Now, in the immediate wake of John Brown's raid, virtually everyone in the country was appalled and distanced themselves from John Brown and his men. He was profoundly ridiculed. It was roughly 2 weeks before Brown was executed that Emerson, who at the time was the nation's foremost public intellectual, he made Christopher Hitchens sound like a, Yahoo. He was infinitely more influential in the North than Christopher Hitchens is today. And he famously, borrowing the words from a woman friend, Mattie Griffiths, said that John Brown will make the gallows glorious like the cross. And in so doing, he made Brown a martyr. And increasingly, Northerners saw him as a martyr. John Brown's raid quite explicitly helps to elect Abraham Lincoln. Now, Lincoln never endorsed Brown. He said that Brown was justly hung. But Brown's raid caused such explosion throughout the nation that the Democratic Party split along sectional lines. Stephen Douglas, who you've just heard, becomes the Northern Democratic nominee in the 1860 election, and John C. Breckinridge becomes the Southern Democratic nominee. And in splitting the Democratic Party, suddenly the Democrats don't have the votes needed to defeat the Republican nominee or the Republican incumbent. Before John Brown's raid, Lincoln was a distant third as a political candidate in the Republican nomination. The front runner was William Seward, probably the best known Republican of his day. Seward, in the wake of John Brown's raid, begins backtracking on his much more progressive anti-slavery views. Seward was famous for giving a speech in the Senate in which he exclaimed that there is a higher law than the Constitution, there is a higher law than slavery, it's God's law, and that's what we will rely on. Seward was also known as another speech famously saying there is an irrepressible conflict between the North and South. We need to rely on higher law. After John Brown's raid, Seward suddenly says, I didn't really mean what I said about higher law. I didn't mean what I said about the irrepressible conflict. And suddenly he's seen as spineless. Suddenly the conflict of his character, the content of his character comes into question. Salmon Chase, the second front runner of the Republican Party, had been a friend of John Brown in Ohio, had given Brown money, and in the wake of Brown's raid, letters between Chase and John Brown suddenly make the front page of newspapers throughout the North, and Chase is now damaged goods. And suddenly Lincoln, who's more conservative than Chase and Seward, Lincoln, who never states, unlike progressive Republicans, that the fugitive slave law is unconstitutional, let's ignore it, Lincoln becomes a viable candidate. And without John Brown, his raid, the influence of Gerrit Smith, Frederick Douglass, others, Abraham Lincoln never would have been elected. Thank you.
We will hear introduced by Professor Zarefsky from this gentleman on my left, who I trust is familiar to many of you, perhaps less familiar, but I think after this next offering is finished, you'll be much more knowledgeable about the gentleman on my right. So thank you one and all, and Professor Zarefsky.
There were 7 Lincoln-Douglas debates as they contested for the Senate seat from Illinois. Each was 3 hours long. Although the full text remains available, and I'm sure that Lincoln and Douglas are in undiminished vigor after 150 years, we will spare you. To set the stage, Washington opposed political parties, but almost immediately around Hamilton formed the Conservative Federalist Party. Around Jefferson formed the Democratic Republicans, the predecessor of today's Democratic Party. Between 1801 and 1841, all the presidents were either Jeffersonian or Jacksonian Democrats. Douglas was the leading Democrat in America at the time of the debates in 1858. In reaction to Andrew Jackson, in 1834, the Whigs, led by Clay and Webster, supplanted the Federalists. Lincoln, who idolized Henry Clay, was a staunch Whig. The South feared abolition, sentiment for which was developing in some quarters of the North. Various compromises kept the party together. In the mid-1850s, a new party formed around Northern abolitionists, disaffected Democrats, and former Whigs. This new party is the Republican Party of today, the party of Lincoln. Douglas aspired to be president and to expand the country to the Pacific. He secured the repeal of the Missouri Compromise and sought to organize the Kansas and Nebraska territories. To keep Southern support, Douglas advocated letting the people of a territory choose whether to be free or slave. Of course, he meant the white people. This policy he called popular sovereignty. Lincoln now saw Douglas as vulnerable because of the consequences of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The opponents: Douglas was a lawyer, state legislator, judge, and then a dominant U.S. senator, 4 years younger than Lincoln. Fearless and hard drinking. Uninterested in wealth, his passions were politics and power on a national scale. He and Lincoln had been rivals for over 20 years. Douglas at one point courted Mary Todd at the same time as Lincoln did. Only 5'2" and stout, a gifted orator with deep voice, graceful gestures, and an immaculate dresser, known as the Little Giant. The most brilliant figure in political life of that day, winning in personality, fearless as an advocate, magnetic in eloquence, shrewd in political maneuvering. He respected Lincoln's abilities and nervously feared him as an opponent. He said, "I shall have my hands full." Lincoln, born in Kentucky, impoverished as a youth, and self-educated. He was a state legislator and served a single 2-year term in the U.S. House of Representatives. He despised Douglas, often characterizing him as a liar, but he envied Douglas's success. 6'4", huge for that period, beardless at this time. His long arms gave him an ape-like appearance. His clothes were wrinkled, his pants too short. Enormously strong, a sallow complexion, wrinkled, somewhat melancholy. His voice was piercing, and when it became agitated, it was shrill and sharp. He used few gestures during the debates, keeping his hands behind his back when speaking, but when excited, he would flail about. He was portrayed as a country bumpkin, a rail splitter and farm boy, but in truth, he was an accomplished lawyer and shrewd politician with few equals. Although there were 7 debates, both Lincoln and Douglas gave hundreds of other speeches during the Senate campaign. Douglas was ahead and was not eager to have the debates, but couldn't seem unwilling. Newly perfected shorthand transcriptions transmitted through the telegraph are our source for the texts of the debates. Desiring national exposure, Lincoln wouldn't start speaking until the shorthand reporter arrived. Attendance was high, as many as 15,000 people. The unpaved streets became clouded in dust. The crowds were raucous. Parades, drinking, fireworks, and cannon fire preceded the debates. One train arrived with 16 cars and 1,000 passengers. There was no moderator. The first speaker was given 1 hour, followed by the other for an hour and a half. And then the first speaker was given a final half hour. The debaters pretty much took it easy on each other. Douglas called his opponent Mr. Lincoln, and Lincoln always used Judge Douglas. Douglas would at times shake his fist at Lincoln's face. When Lincoln spoke, Douglas would sit calmly, smoking his cigar. Lincoln was less serene. Sometimes grimacing or biting his nails, he interrupted or made faces at the crowd, admonishing them not to believe Douglas.
I have known Lincoln since I was a high school teacher, and he owned a saloon in Salem, Illinois. We were both comparatively boys, struggling with poverty in a strange land. He was more successful in his occupation than I was in mine, and got into the legislature. Lincoln is one of those peculiar men who perform with admirable skill everything that they undertake. I met him there and had a sympathy with him because of the uphill struggle we both had in life. He was as good then at telling stories as he is now. He could drink more liquor with all the boys in town than anyone. He liked fistfights, wrestling, and horse races. He could beat any of the boys at wrestling or running a foot race in horseshoes or shot put. I was in the Senate when he came to Washington as a congressman and was glad to welcome my old friend and companion. In Congress, he was in opposition to the Mexican War and took the side of the common enemy against his own country. When he came home, he found the indignation of the people followed him everywhere and was again obliged to retire. In Congress, as a representative of this state, he declared the Mexican War to be unjust and infamous and would not support or acknowledge his own country to be right in the contest because he said that American blood was not shed on American soil. He degraded himself by allowing his friends to carry him on their backs through the public streets. He must be crazy if to be so carried if he could walk. It is Lincoln's house that is divided and cannot stand. His party in the northern part of the state hold the abolitionist platform, but in the south and the center, they do not. I know now this will bring down on him the vengeance of his own scriptural quotation. His party, abolition, in one end of the state and opposed to it in the other, is a house divided against itself and cannot stand for the attempts to cheat the American people out of their votes by disguising its sentiments. Mr. Lincoln attempts to cover up his abolition by telling you he was raised a little east of here in Indiana. And he thinks that makes a mighty good and sound man out of him on all these questions. True. I was not born out west here. I was born away down in Yankee land in a fertile valley in Vermont. I love the old Green Mountains where I played in my childhood. I was awarded an honorary degree, and with my heart full and swelling, I said, my friends, Vermont is the most glorious spot to be born, provided one emigrates when he is very young. I love our broad Illinois prairies, and my vision was no longer bound by narrow valleys, but I wished to be judged by my principles, not where a man was born. You, sir, follow me around the state, stealing my audiences, and your followers have interrupted my speeches and started brawls. It was a preconcerted plan, and I am warranted in challenging Mr. Lincoln has been a party to these actions. When I used to practice law with Mr. Lincoln, when he was beaten a case, he got mad at the judge and made stump speeches to the people against the judge. Now, I never dreamed of doing this. When I lost, I never took it outside the courthouse.
Judge Douglas, you provoked me by misrepresenting me. I worked very hard in New Salem, Illinois, as a postmaster, surveyor, and storekeeper. But I never made any money and spent many years paying off my debts. I never served a drink. Maybe I ran a still once up in the hollow. But if I was behind the bar serving liquor, you, sir, were in front of it drinking your fill. Your wife follows you around so you don't get drunk. And you need a servant to hold your bottles. I never opposed our soldiers in the Mexican War. I would not agree that the war was righteously begun. It was not. I challenged the president to show me the exact spot where Mexico fired a shot on our land. It was commenced by the president, but I never once refused to support the troops or the conduct of the war once it was commenced. It isn't true, isn't that true, Flicklin? Flicklin, you're here somewhere. Now, Flicklin, you were there. Tell the truth. Tell them the truth. I supported the troops.
It is so. I was there. I saw it. It is so. I hope he isn't going to ask me any questions.
Judge Douglas is in the habit, in almost all his speeches, of charging falsehood upon his adversaries, myself and others. The judge has set about seriously trying to make the impression that I am literally in his clutches, that I am a poor, helpless, decrepit mouse, that I trembled and had to be carried off the stands. I don't want to quarrel with him or call him a liar, but when I come square up to him, I don't know what else to call him if I must tell the truth out. When Judge Douglas impeaches my honor, my veracity, and my candor, I do not understand that I am bound to keep my hands off of him. In public life, his ambition to be president entices him to utter falsehoods. Anxious Democrats see in his round, jolly, fruitful face post offices, land offices, cabinet appointments, ambassadorships bursting out in wonderful exuberance, ready to be laid hold of by their greedy hands.
The subject that occupied probably the most time in these debates were allegations of conspiracy and plot. Douglas accused Lincoln of plotting to demolish the old Whig Party and the Democrats as well, with the intention of converting both of them to abolitionism, or black republicanism, as he called it. There was no truth to this accusation. Douglas also alleged that Lincoln was in cahoots with President Buchanan to use federal patronage to remove Douglas Democrats from office and to influence the press. Lincoln, not to be outdone, alleged that Douglas conspired with Chief Justice Roger Taney, Presidents Pierce and Buchanan, to spread slavery across the nation. Lincoln warned that a second Dred Scott decision was in the offing, which would prevent states from outlawing slavery, just as the real Dred Scott decision had prevented territories from doing so. This contention was also far-fetched.
I never had anything to do with the abolitionist resolutions of the Illinois Republican Party. I wasn't there when the convention was in session, nor have I ever tried to destroy the old Whig Party. The repeal of the Missouri Compromise is wrong. It will let slavery into Kansas and Nebraska. It will allow it to spread into every other part of the country. The case of Dred Scott says that under the Constitution, people cannot exclude slavery from the territory. Next, it will be decided it cannot be excluded from a state. This man, Judge Douglas, sticks to a decision which forbids the people of a territory from excluding slavery. He does not address the issue of whether slavery is wrong in of itself. Jackson did not believe in the binding force of decisions. It is nothing to Douglas that Jefferson did not believe so. I cannot shake Judge Douglas's teeth loose from the Dred Scott decision, like some obstinate animal that will hang on when he has once got his teeth fixed. You may cut off a leg or tear away an arm. Still, he will not relax his hold. Douglas, handmaiden of the South, aided by the Supreme Court, will reestablish slavery in every state. You can fool all of the people some of the time, and you can fool some of the people all of the time. But you cannot fool all of the people all of the time. Judge Douglas wants to plant the institution of slavery all over the nation. He looks to no end of this terrible condition. If Judge Douglas gets his way and allows the expansion of slavery into the territories by a vote of the people, then he will grab more territory from poor Mexico and invade the rich lands of South America and the islands of the Caribbean, each one promising additional slave fields. Dred Scott, I combat, is a dehumanizing the Negro, to take away from him the right to ever be striving to be a man. It is a perversion of what I have said to maintain that in states where slavery exists, it shall be abolished. But I insist that new territories shall be kept free from it while in a territorial condition.
Mr. Lincoln, the country was divided into two great political parties known as Whig and Democratic parties. Both were national and patriotic. Whig principles had no boundary. They were not limited by the Ohio River, nor by the Potomac, nor by the line of free and slave states, but applied and were proclaimed whatever the Constitution ruled or the American flag wherever it waved over American soil. So it was and is with the great Democratic Party, which from the days of Jefferson has been the historic party of this nation. Whig, whose heroes were Clay and Webster, and Democrat, whose heroes were Jefferson and Jackson. They differed over a national bank, a tariff, and internal improvements, but agreed on the slavery question. Both parties agreed that it should be the right of the people in each state and territory to decide their local and domestic institutions for themselves. There have been no division in this country in regard to the principle except the opposition of the abolitionists. Let each state mind its own business and leave its neighbors alone. The abolitionists and black Republicans opposed this principle. Lincoln and his friends have conspired to dissolve the Democratic and Whig parties and connect the members under the name and disguise of the Black Abolitionist Republican Party. Lincoln went to work to abolitionize the old Whig Party, pretending he was as good a Whig as ever. He will transfer members of the old Whig Party bound hand and foot to the Abolition Party led by Fred Douglass. They wish to make all territories free and slavery in the District of Columbia and end the fugitive slave law. Lincoln has said this government cannot endure permanently. He wants to tear apart the Union and start a war of succession. The Black Republican Party has said that when a party becomes subversive to the ends for which they are established, it is the right and duty of the people to organize parties upon such principles as the nation may demand. Lincoln has said, repudiate your previous party attachments. Bring Kansas and Nebraska back to the position of free territories. End the slave trade between the states. Restrict slavery to those states where it exists. End the fugitive slave law. Abolish slavery in the District of Columbia. Acquire no more territories lest they be free. But Lincoln will not admit he favors these principles. I now put the question to Abraham Lincoln this day. Do you stand by the articles of that black Republican creed that I have just put before you? All other parties have been national in character, but now you have a sectional organization, a party which appeals to the northern section of the Union against the southern, a party which appeals to northern passion, northern prejudices, northern ambition against southern people, against southern states, against southern institutions. They wish to unite the northern states in one great sectional party, and since the North is strongest of the sections, they will thus be enabled to outvote, conquer, govern, and control the South. And what is Mr. Lincoln's purpose in destroying these great parties? That Lincoln would be sent to the Senate. They attempted to put Fred Douglass, a Negro, on the stand at a Democratic meeting, and now they have a Negro traversing the northern counties on behalf of Lincoln. Fred Douglass and the Negro brethren conjures all friends to rally around one man, Lincoln, the perfect embodiment of their principles. Huzzah.
By today's standards, at the time of the debates, both Lincoln and Douglass were racist. The difference was that Lincoln believed that slavery was immoral, whereas Douglass, with his eye on the presidency and Southern support, was indifferent to the morality of slavery. Douglass portrayed Lincoln as favoring immediate emancipation and absolute perfect equality of the races. Lincoln favored no such thing. Lincoln wanted slavery banned from the territories and the new states. This period was also characterized by sentimental worship of the Founding Fathers. Both Lincoln and Douglass argued that the Founding Fathers, the Constitution, and the Declaration of Independence supported their views.
Slavery is a monstrous injustice. It deprives us of setting a Republican example for the rest of the world. It enables the enemies of free institutions. It is warfare upon the Declaration of Independence. I have no lawful right, directly or indirectly, to interfere with slavery in the states where it exists. My first impulse is to free all the slaves and send them to Liberia. But there is not enough shipping and money to send them there. We cannot make them equals politically or socially. There is a physical difference between the two races, which forbids them from living together upon a footing of perfect equality. The race to which I belong must have the superior position. But the Negro is entitled to all the natural rights enumerated in the Declaration of Independence and the pursuit of happiness as the white man. He is not my equal in moral or intellectual endowment, but he is the equal of every living man in his right to be free. I am in favor of the fugitive slave law. I'm not against the admission of additional slave states. I believe it is the right and duty of Congress to prohibit slavery in all of the United States territories. Slavery has been an apple of discord and an element of division in the House. Our fathers intended that it should not spread. They restricted it from the new territories and ended the slave trade. Judge Douglas infers from my speeches that the Negroes and the whites should be marrying each other. He says, I wish to set the states upon each other. There will be no peace until we all agree that it is in the course of ultimate extinction. A house divided against itself cannot stand. The further spread of slavery will either be arrested or its advocates will push it forward until it should become alike lawful in all of the states, old as well as new. Judge Douglas says, why can't we let it stand as our fathers placed it? When the government was first established, it was the policy of its founders to prohibit the spread of slavery in the new territories of the United States, where it had not existed. But Judge Douglas has broken up that policy and placed it on a new basis, by which it is to become national and perpetual. All the trouble and convulsion has proceeded from efforts to spread it over more territories. The entire record of the world may be searched in vain for one single affirmation from one single man that freedom for all men was not included in the Declaration of Independence. When Judge Douglas teaches that the Negro has no share in the Declaration of Independence, he is blowing out the moral lights around us. He is penetrating the human soul and eradicating the light of reason and the love of liberty, and preparing the public by his vast influence for making the institution of slavery perpetual and national. The Declaration of Independence set up a maxim for a free society, which should be familiar to all, constantly looked to, constantly labored for, and even though never perfectly attained, constantly approximating, and thereby constantly spreading and deepening its influence and augmenting its happiness and value of life to all people of all colors everywhere. The fathers meant to declare this right of freedom so that the enforcement of it might follow as swiftly as circumstances should permit. If we all were agreed that slavery should not spread, I would gladly agree that Judge Douglas should be senator and not I.
Abolitionism is revolutionary and destructive of the existence of this government. Washington, Jefferson, Franklin, Madison, Hamilton, and Jay made this government and divided it into free states and slave states. They knew that in a country wide and broad as this, the people require different laws. The people have the complete right and power to do as they please within their boundaries. By what authority does Mr. Lincoln proclaim that this government is contrary to the law of God and cannot stand? It has stood thus divided into free and slave states from its origins. We have grown from 4 millions to 30 millions. We have extended from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. We have acquired the Floridas and Texas and other territories sufficient to double our geographical extent. We have increased in population, in wealth, and in power beyond any example on earth. We have risen from a weak and feeble power to become the terror of the civilized world. All this under a constitution where Mr. Lincoln says is in violation of the law of God. We do not want our prairies covered with black settlements. Do you desire to turn this beautiful state into a free Negro colony? I am opposed to Negro citizenship in any and every form. I believe this government was made by white men for the benefit of white men and their posterity forever. I am in favor of limiting citizenship to white men of European descent, and it should not be conferred upon Negroes, Indians, or other inferior races. I do not regard the Negro as my equal, and positively deny that he is my brother or kin to me, whatever. But the Negro is not a slave. Each state and territory must decide for itself what the Negro's rights shall be. If you desire Negro citizenship, if you desire to allow them to come into the state and settle with the white man, if you desire them to vote on an equality with yourselves and to make them eligible for office, to serve on juries, and to judge your rights, then support Mr. Lincoln. Mr. Lincoln claims that Negro equality is guaranteed by the laws of God. If the Almighty ever intended the Negro to be the equal of the white man, he has been a long time in demonstrating the fact. For thousands of years, the Negro has been a race upon the earth, and during all that time, in all latitudes and climate, wherever he has wandered or has been taken by others, he has been inferior to the race he has met there. I hold that humanity and Christianity both require that the Negro shall have and enjoy every right, every privilege, and every immunity consistent with the safety of the society in which he lives. When that principle is recognized, then you will have peace and harmony and fraternal feeling between all the states of the Union. Until you do recognize that doctrine, there will be sectional warfare, agitating and distracting the country. Now, I say to you, my fellow citizens, the signers of the Declaration of Independence had no reference to the Negro whatever when they declared all white men to be created equal. They desired to express by that phrase white men of European birth and descent, and had no reference to the Negro, the savage Indians, the Fiji, the Malay, or any other inferior or degraded race. At that time, every one of the 13 colonies was slaveholding, and not one of them emancipated his slaves, not one of them. When Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration, the document he was the owner of, at that time, he held many slaves and continued to do so until his death. When the Declaration of Independence was put forth, every one of the 13 colonies was slaveholding, and every man who signed that document represented a slaveholding state. No one of them emancipated his slaves after he signed the Declaration. They all continued to hold their slaves during the Revolutionary War. It does not follow that the Negro should be a slave. As an inferior race, it ought to possess every right, privilege, and immunity which he can safely exercise, consistent with the safety of society in which he lives. Such is required by our humanity and Christianity. The people of each state must determine the nature and extent of that privilege. Under the policy, slavery was abolished in many states. From 1 out of 12 states, free states are now the majority, with the power to control the House of Representatives and the Senate, and the power to elect a northern president without the aid of a slave state. Having gained this power, are you now prepared to wage war on the South until you abolish slavery everywhere?
If we've whetted your appetite, there are several editions of the texts of the debates easily available. There's another 20 hours and 40 minutes of this stuff to read. Strong in the beginning, Douglas tired over the course of the debates while Lincoln gained strength. Lincoln most likely won the popular vote, but U.S. senators were not elected by direct popular vote. Douglas won the majority of legislative districts, and the Illinois legislature re-elected him to the Senate 54-46. But the debates gave Lincoln national exposure, so that in 1860 he outmaneuvered his rivals for the Republican nomination. Douglas obtained the Democratic nomination for the presidency, but the debates robbed him of Southern support, and the party split. Lincoln, in debate, had forced Douglas to publicize his belief that slavery could be kept out of the territories despite the Dred Scott decision. This was anathema to the South. It lost Douglas the support of the South and doomed his presidential candidacy. It was a four-way race. Lincoln, having split the Democrats, won decisively in the electoral vote. Was Lincoln's eye on the presidency when he crafted this strategy during the debates? Well, the historians can't be sure. Not long after the election, barely 2 months after the attack on Fort Sumter, Douglas died while speaking in support of Lincoln and the Union. Thank you.
So friends, we're drawing, believe it or not, to the end. We have a town-wide chorus, representatives of the different churches and choirs that will help to conclude the evening before an old veteran and a young youth give us the taps. So welcome Concord's town-wide chorus, and particularly Robert Barney, who's been good enough from Trinity Episcopal to gather and lift up these voices. Please come forward.
I'd also like to thank our accompanist, Polly Oliver.
we have our concluding taps with our trumpet player, our older veteran, and our young student come forward. Thank you one and all for your patience. I think we've done justice to Abraham Lincoln tonight, his 200th anniversary. Again, thanks to one and all.